Hey there, Eli coming at you again from the fish room of OSA Coventry, here today with another episode of Ecology with Eli. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about a topic that is directly related to the behavior of some fishes, especially some that we like to keep in our reef aquariums. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about shoaling behavior and how we can apply that to our own personal aquariums at home. Now, shoaling is a really cool behavior of certain type of fish in which large groups of the same species of fish will gather in the same area. So this kind of can differ from schooling behavior in that it's a little less organized. So most of the time with a shoaling fish versus a schooling fish, they are mostly just hanging out in the same area. It's not necessarily a very organized grouping in which one takes lead and the rest follow, but it might be more similar to these chromis that I have behind me here. Whereas these chromis will usually set up in groups on a small coral head out in the wild. They basically all will hang out in the same proximity as each other, but they don't necessarily travel as a group. It's more so that they all just kind of hang out in one generalized area. So that's the basics of shoaling. It's generally just these fish will congregate in one small setting, but they might not necessarily have much of an organized structure to it. You may be wondering how this benefits these fish in the wild. A lot of times the fish that most exhibit this shoaling behavior are actually pretty small fishes. These chromis here behind me maximum get about 2.5 inches long. Damselfish, very similar story. Most of them are going to be on the smaller side. Cardinal fish are another stereotypical shoaling fish, and they also stay pretty small for the most part. And generally hanging out in these small groups makes it a little bit harder for predatory animals, predatory fishes, to single each of these animals out. So if they do congregate in a decent sized group, regardless of whether there's a structure to it, it makes it a little bit more confusing for predatory animals, and it makes it a little bit harder for the predators to pick out singular fishes. So say there's a big lionfish that's scoping the reef out, trying to find something to eat. If he comes across a school of a bunch of damsels, a bunch of chromis, it's going to be a little more confusing for him, all that movement going on, and it's going to be harder for him to single out any individual chromis. Now, that is not to say that he couldn't still snack on a couple, but it does definitely make it a little bit more tricky, a little bit more finicky for that fish to easily prey upon those smaller animals. Now, a little bit contrary to popular belief, just because these fish are shoaling fishes, just because they congregate in these groups, does not necessarily mean that they enjoy each other's company. If you are to see videos or go snorkeling or scuba diving over a reef that has a large shoal of chromis or a large shoal of damselfish that are, say, occupying a large stylophora colony or a big acrophora, or all of these fish are hiding within the branches of a dense stony coral colony, these fish are constantly quarreling within this colony. So they all are really fighting in this small area for a space on that piece of reef. So whereas behind me here, I don't have a ton of structure and a ton of cover for these fish to live in. Generally on the reef where these are going to form those dense shoals, the densest is going to be somewhere that's a very complex reef system. These fish are all going to be basically quarreling, fighting for small square inches worth of space in these dense coral colonies. And this kind of affords them the luxury of being a little bit further from the open waters, and allows them to be a little bit further away from predators as well. So as much as you would kind of guess that these guys are all in the same boat together, and they kind of are, there is still competition amongst these shoaling fishes to where they still want to be the one sole larger fish that's getting the most food and staying the furthest away from predators. Generally, because of this fact, you will oftentimes have the larger individuals that are kind of taking up the most prime real estate on the reefs, and they are also going to be the most aggressive in terms of quarreling with their congeners or others of their same species. Oftentimes, they'll even have some of the smaller, weaker individuals being bullied to the point of death, or to the point of having to move to another location. Now, how does that come into play in our reef tanks? A lot of times people want to emulate this shoaling behavior because it is really cool to be able to see a large group of the same type of fish take up a small area in your aquarium. As I just mentioned, however, it is a little bit different of a scene in most of your aquariums and most of your reef tanks than it is in the wild. There is a lot less coral cover per square inch in most of our aquariums, even if it is a very densely stocked aquarium. And there is just generally a little less real estate for these animals to find structure in. So say you were to add a small group of these guys, or a large group for that matter. Say you had a large 220-gallon aquarium, you bring home a dozen of these fish, and you're hoping that they can all kind of congregate in a Stylophora colony that you have in your aquarium. Now, they are probably going to attempt to make this work. However, oftentimes you still might not have the exact structure that these fish really want, or that these fish really desire to hide in. So oftentimes you'll add these all to the aquarium and you might get a small grouping on one spot of the tank, but oftentimes they're quarreling hard enough that they might push each other to opposite ends of the aquarium. You might end up with two smaller groupings of these fish, or you might just end up with one really big bully that takes exception to having any other chromis in the aquarium with him as well. Unfortunately, as much as it is a really cool behavior to see in the aquariums, sometimes it's just not meant to be. It makes it a little bit more difficult to add groups of these fish to your aquarium. So oftentimes, if that is your goal, having a very complex scape, having a lot of coral, or even just coral skeleton in your aquarium that these fish can kind of hide in will increase your success rate. And just having enough space in the aquarium, having a large enough aquarium to pull this off is a little more important. If you do plan on having this sort of behavior work out in the long run, oftentimes you will lose a couple of these fish in the meantime until they kind of sort things out. But that's not to say that it can't be done in the correct aquarium. Behind me here, I have these really cool pajama cardinals. These are a classic old school aquarium fish. Kind of a silly looking fish, not everybody's favorite, but they've got this really cool spotted pattern with that black bar, just a different looking fish. And these tend to be a little bit more peaceful with each other. So these do also shoal. They're usually more of a mid-water swimmer. So if you add them to an aquarium, they are going to be a little more in the open water than say your chromis or your damselfish would be. And they tend to get along just a little bit better in your aquarium. So if having a shoal or a small group of the same type of fish is something that you're interested in, pajama cardinals tend to be a really good option for that. Sometimes you still get some quarreling, you still get some bickering as these fish form a little bit of a hierarchy, and you might still end up with a larger male, say, that's a little more aggressive with some of the others, but generally they get along a lot better than your chromis do, a lot better than your anthias do, and a lot better than your damselfish do. You still do get this really cool shoaling behavior out of these fish. They still do congregate in a decently tight grouping, but they just tend to be a little more peaceful with each other and work out a little better in the long run. Now, not every species of cardinal fish actually behaves in the same manner. Banggai cardinal fish are one that can be a little bit more finicky to add in a small shoal to your aquarium. Generally, they do a little bit better as pairs if you can sex a male and a female. And if you add a few too many, you often do get quarreling, even between the females if you add them all to the same aquarium. But again, if it's a large enough aquarium, you might be able to pull off a smaller grouping. They may just kind of stake claim to a couple different spots in the tank and spread themselves out accordingly. Another cool example that's a little bit more peaceful with each other are those zebra bar gobies that I talked about in a video about a week ago. Those are another really cool shoaling addition to your aquarium. Some of your other dartfish species, such as scissor-tailed dartfish, and some of these other species as well, they do pretty well in a group with a little less quarreling involved. They're a little more peaceful with each other, and they tend to give that same cool shoaling behavior with a little less drama involved. So those are another really cool option if you wanted to add a shoaling fish. Those scissor-tailed dartfish, zebra bar gobies tend to get along quite well and offer you a little bit of a different shoaling behavior in a different area of the water column. So I hope you guys found the topic of shoaling fish pretty interesting. It's definitely a neat thing to think about, and maybe there is a little bit of a misunderstanding as to how we can make this behavior work out a little bit better in our aquariums, but it is definitely something that can be done if you plan the tank out right. And if nothing else, there are certain species that are a little more appropriate for the shoaling behavior in your tank if that's something that you want to get away with. As always, thank you guys for tuning in with me for another episode of Ecology with Eli. Hope you found this one pretty interesting. Let me know in the comments section below if you have questions, maybe suggestions for some of your future videos, and keep on reading.